Why Japan's best soldiers were terrified of one enemy, and it wasn't America. On August 9, 1945, the same day the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki, 1.5 million Soviet soldiers crashed into Japanese-held Manchuria in an offensive so fast and so violent that entire Japanese armies were surrounded and destroyed before their commanders even understood what was happening. In 11 days, the Soviets killed 84,000 Japanese soldiers, captured over 600,000, and seized a territory larger than Western Europe. The Kwantung Army, once considered the most elite fighting force in the Japanese Empire, was annihilated with a speed that made every other campaign of the Second World War look slow. Most people have never heard of this operation, and that silence hides one of the most important military events of the 20th century, because a growing number of historians now argue that it was not the atomic bombs that forced Japan to surrender. It was the sheer terror of what the Soviet Union did in those 11 days. To understand how Japan reached this point, you have to go back years before August 1945. The Japanese military had a complicated and deeply fearful relationship with the Soviet Union that shaped their strategic thinking throughout the entire war. That fear did not come from theory. It came from direct experience on the battlefield. And it started with a disaster the Japanese spent years trying to forget. In the summer of 1939, while the world watched Hitler's moves in Europe, a border conflict between Japan and the Soviet Union escalated into a full-scale battle at a place called Khalkhin Gol on the Mongolian-Manchurian border. The Japanese Kwantung Army, confident in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over Soviet materiel, launched an offensive, expecting to overwhelm the Soviets through aggression and willpower. What they ran into instead was a commander who would later become the most feared general of the entire Second World War, Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov assembled a strike force that the Japanese did not know existed. While the Japanese focused on the infantry battle at the front, Zhukov quietly moved hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces into position on both flanks. On August 20, 1939, he launched a double envelopment that caught the Japanese completely by surprise. Soviet armor swept around both sides of the Japanese force and closed behind them like a steel trap. The Japanese Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed. The numbers were devastating. Over 18,000 Japanese casualties, including nearly 8,000 dead. The Soviets lost roughly equal numbers, but they could absorb the losses. Japan could not afford to ignore the lesson. Japanese soldiers who survived Khalkhin Gol returned to their units with stories that contradicted everything the Imperial Army taught about Soviet weakness. The Soviet tanks were faster and more numerous than anything Japan possessed. Soviet artillery was overwhelming in volume and accuracy. Soviet coordination between air power, armor, and infantry was years ahead of what Japanese forces could achieve. The myth of Japanese spiritual superiority, shattering Soviet machines, died in the grass of Mongolia. The defeat at Khalkhin Gol had consequences that shaped the entire course of the Second World War in ways most people never learn about. The Japanese military was divided into two strategic factions. The Strike North faction wanted to attack the Soviet Union through Siberia to seize resources and territory. The Strike South faction wanted to attack the Western colonial empires in Southeast Asia to grab oil, rubber, and tin. Before Khalkhin Gol, the Strike North faction had significant support among senior officers. After Khalkhin Gol, it was finished. The Japanese High Command looked at what Zhukov had done to their best army and decided they never wanted to face Soviet armor again. Japan signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union in April 1941 and turned south. Pearl Harbor followed 8 months later. The Soviet defeat of Japan at Khalkhin Gol literally redirected the entire war. But the fear never went away. Throughout the war years from 1941 to 1945, the Kwantung Army sat in Manchuria, watching the Soviet border with a nervousness that bordered on obsession. At its peak, the Kwantung Army numbered over 1 million men and was considered the most prestigious posting in the Japanese military. The best officers, the best equipment, the most experienced soldiers, all positioned not to fight the Americans in the Pacific, but to guard against the threat from the north that Japanese commanders never stopped fearing. As the war in the Pacific turned against Japan through 1944 and into 1945, the High Command began stripping the Kwantung Army of its best units. Veteran divisions were pulled out and shipped south to defend the Philippines, Iwo Jima and Okinawa against the advancing Americans. They were replaced with raw conscripts, reservists, and hastily assembled formations with minimal training. By the summer of 1945, the Kwantung Army still had roughly 700,000 men on paper, but it was a hollow force, a shell of what it had been. The equipment was outdated. The soldiers were undertrained. The fortifications along the border were incomplete, and the commanders knew that if the Soviets ever came, they were not ready. The Soviets came on August 9, 1945. Stalin had been planning the Manchurian offensive for months with a level of secrecy and logistical precision that remains astonishing even by modern standards. Over 1.5 million soldiers were moved across the entire width of the Soviet Union, many of them veterans of the victory over Germany, transferred directly from the European front. Thousands of tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces and trucks were shipped east along the Trans-Siberian Railway, in a logistical operation that dwarfed anything the Western Allies had attempted. The man chosen to command the offensive was Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, one of the finest strategic minds in the Soviet military, but the operational concept bore the unmistakable fingerprints of Zhukov himself, the same commander who had crushed the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol 6 years earlier. The plan was a massive double envelopment on a continental scale. Khalkhin Gol multiplied by 100. 3 Soviet fronts would attack simultaneously from 3 different directions. From the west, the Trans-Baikal front under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky would drive across the Gobi Desert and through the Greater Khingan mountain range, terrain the Japanese considered impassable for armored forces. From the east, the first Far Eastern Front would strike into eastern Manchuria. From the north, the second Far Eastern Front would push south along the Amur and Ussuri rivers. The 3 pincers would converge deep inside Manchuria, trapping the entire Kwantung Army in a pocket from which there was no escape. The attack began at midnight. Soviet forces crossed the border without the preliminary artillery bombardment that conventional doctrine demanded. There was no warning. Japanese border units were overwhelmed before they could send coherent reports to headquarters. By dawn, Soviet armored columns had already penetrated deep into Manchuria along multiple axes of advance. What followed was a demonstration of mechanized warfare at a speed and scale that the world had never seen. The Trans-Baikal Front performed what many military historians consider the single most impressive operational maneuver of the entire Second World War. Soviet tank columns crossed the Gobi Desert and then drove straight through the Greater Khingan Mountains, a range that rose to over 5,000 feet, with passes that the Japanese had calculated would stop any armored advance. Soviet engineers and tank crews pushed through in 48 hours. They arrived on the Manchurian plain behind the main Japanese defensive lines before the Kwantung Army even knew they were coming. Japanese commanders received reports that made no sense to them. Soviet tanks appearing 100 miles behind the front line. Entire defensive positions bypassed and irrelevant. Communication lines cut. Supply depots overrun. The carefully planned defensive strategy that the Kwantung Army had spent years preparing collapsed in hours because the Soviets simply went around it. The speed was devastating. Soviet armored spearheads advanced up to 50 miles per day across terrain that should have slowed them to a crawl. Japanese units that attempted to stand and fight were surrounded and annihilated by combined arms forces that attacked with a coordination and ferocity that Japanese veterans described as overwhelming. Units that attempted to retreat found Soviet forces already behind them, blocking every escape route. The air campaign was equally one-sided. Soviet aircraft destroyed Japanese airfields in the opening hours, achieving total air superiority before the first day was over. Japanese soldiers who had spent years fighting Americans in the Pacific jungles, where air attacks came from carrier-based aircraft in limited numbers, now experienced something completely different. Waves of Soviet ground attack aircraft striking with a relentless persistence that never let up from dawn to dark. Japanese resistance was not insignificant. Individual units fought with the fanaticism that characterized Japanese military culture throughout the war. Banzai charges were launched against Soviet positions. Soldiers fought to the death rather than surrender, as their training demanded. But individual courage was meaningless against the Soviet system. A banzai charge against a line of T-34 tanks, supported by massed artillery, achieved nothing except adding to the casualty lists. The fortified positions along the border that were supposed to delay the Soviet advance held for hours instead of the weeks they were designed to withstand. Soviet assault teams had spent 4 years perfecting the art of destroying fortifications during the campaigns against Germany. The techniques they had developed smashing through the Siegfried Line and the defenses of Berlin were now applied to Japanese bunkers with the same methodical brutality. Flamethrowers, explosive charges, direct fire from heavy artillery at point-blank range. The Japanese defenders died in their positions without slowing the advance. Within 5 days, the Kwantung Army had effectively ceased to exist as a coordinated fighting force. Individual pockets of resistance continued, but the army as a strategic entity was finished. Soviet forces had advanced so deep into Manchuria that they were approaching Korea and threatening to invade the Japanese home islands from the north. This is the part of the story that most people never hear, and it changes everything about how we understand the end of the Second World War. The traditional narrative says Japan surrendered because of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. But Japanese government records declassified in the decades since the war tell a more complicated story. The Supreme War Council met on August 9th to discuss surrender. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima 3 days earlier had been discussed, but had not produced a decision to surrender. The military faction still argued that Japan could fight on and inflict enough casualties during an American invasion to negotiate better terms. What changed the calculation on August 9th was not the second atomic bomb. It was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. The news that reached Tokyo that morning was catastrophic on a strategic level that went far beyond the destruction of 2 cities. Japan's entire strategic plan for ending the war depended on one assumption: that the Soviet Union would remain neutral and could serve as a mediator for a negotiated peace. Japanese diplomats had been desperately trying to use Moscow as an intermediary with the Western allies for months. The Soviet attack destroyed that last hope completely. Worse, the speed of the Soviet advance through Manchuria demonstrated that the Soviets could invade the Japanese home islands from the north through Hokkaido, opening a second front that Japan had no forces to defend. The Americans would come from the south. The Soviets would come from the north. Japan would be crushed between 2 invasions with no possibility of the negotiated settlement the military faction still dreamed of. Emperor Hirohito broke the deadlock in the Supreme War Council and announced his decision to surrender. In his speech to the council, he mentioned the atomic bombs, but he also specifically cited the Soviet entry into the war as a decisive factor. The Soviet invasion had destroyed Japan's last strategic option. 600,000 Japanese soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. They were sent to labor camps across Siberia, where tens of thousands died from cold, disease, and starvation over the following years. The survivors who eventually returned to Japan carried with them memories of Soviet military power that haunted them for the rest of their lives. They had seen the machine that crushed Germany turn its full weight on Japan and destroy everything in its path in less than 2 weeks. The Manchurian campaign remains one of the most impressive military operations ever conducted. The scale, the speed, the coordination across thousands of miles of hostile terrain, the destruction of an army of 700,000 in 11 days. By every measurable standard, it ranks alongside or above the greatest operations of the Western Allies. But it disappeared from Western memory almost immediately. The Cold War began, and the Soviet Union became the enemy. American historians emphasized the atomic bombs as the decisive factor in ending the war. The Soviet contribution was minimized, ignored, or simply forgotten. It did not fit the narrative that the West wanted to tell about how the war ended. The Japanese did not forget. Veterans of the Kwantung Army who survived Soviet captivity spoke for the rest of their lives about the terror of facing an enemy that combined overwhelming firepower with a speed of advance that made resistance pointless. They had fought the Americans across the Pacific and understood American power. But they described the Soviet offensive in Manchuria in different terms entirely. The Americans were powerful and relentless. The Soviets were an avalanche that buried everything in its path before anyone could react. I want to know what you think. Was it the atomic bombs or the Soviet invasion that truly forced Japan to surrender? Drop your answer in the comments. The men who planned and executed the Manchurian offensive went on to become the architects of Soviet military doctrine during the Cold War. The techniques they perfected in those 11 days, deep penetration by armored forces, massive encirclement, destruction of command structures before the enemy could react, became the foundation of Soviet operational planning for a potential war in Europe. NATO commanders who studied the Manchurian campaign during the Cold War understood exactly what they would face if Soviet tanks ever rolled west across the German border. They had seen what those tanks did to the Kwantung Army. And the armies waiting in West Germany were not significantly larger than the force the Soviets had destroyed in 11 days in August 1945. The same year the Soviets annihilated Japan's best army in Manchuria, classified documents in Washington and London revealed that the Western Allies had their own secret fears about Soviet military power. Churchill had already drawn up Operation Unthinkable, a plan to attack the Soviet Union using rearmed German soldiers. His own generals told him it was suicide. The Manchurian campaign proved they were right. The machine that destroyed the Kwantung Army in 11 days was not something any Western army could have stopped in 1945. And the men who built that machine knew it.